Factoring by grouping. This is a method of factoring we use when there are four terms. So a polynomial that has four terms, we would factor that by grouping. So what that means is we'll group together our first two terms and we group together the last two terms. So we just look at the x cubed plus 5x squared and we ask ourselves, what's the greatest common factor between those two terms? Okay. So we're looking at our coefficients are 1 and 5. The greatest common factor there would be 1. And then we look at the variables. We have x cubed here and x squared there. They both have an x. The least amount of times as a factor is twice. So our GCF for that is x squared. So when we divide both of those terms by x squared, we would get x plus 5. Then we move on and we look at those second two terms, 2x plus 10. Look at their coefficients, 2 and 10. Those are both divisible by 2. They do not both have an x, so our greatest common factor is 2. When we divide both of those terms by 2, we get x plus 10. Notice, x plus 5 is what we got both times when we divided by the GCF. This x plus 5 is called the common binomial. They both have x plus 5. When we factor out the x plus 5, we would write that first. So if we divided this all by x plus 5, that would leave us with x squared. If we divided this second part by x plus 5, that leaves us with plus 2. So to recap, the common binomial will be your first factor, and then your greatest common factors will go in your second factor. We could check our answer by distributing. Okay, so if I take x times x squared, I'd get x cubed. Distributing x times 2, I get 2x. Distributing the 5 times x squared gives us 5x squared. 5 times 2 gives us 10. So now I still have the same four terms as the original expression. They're not in the same order, but that's okay because addition is commutative. So I could rearrange the sum of these terms and it would be equivalent to that. So looking at number 1, we group together the first two terms and we ask ourselves, what's the greatest common factor between x cubed and 2x squared? That would be x squared. When we divide both of those terms by x squared, we would get x plus 2. Then we move on and look at the last two terms and ask ourselves, what's their greatest common factor? 7 and 14 are both divisible by 7. There's not an x in both terms, so our greatest common factor is 7. So dividing both of those terms by 7 would give us x plus 2. So notice our common binomial is x plus 2, and the greatest common factors were x squared plus 7. Those go together in our second factor. Number 2, look at your first two terms and ask yourself, what's the greatest common factor? If you said w squared, you're correct. Dividing both of those by w squared would give us w minus 3. Look at your last two terms and ask yourself, what's the greatest common factor? If you're thinking 8, that's correct. And dividing both of those terms by 8 would give us w minus 24. So notice we got w minus 3. Oh, I said that wrong. Dividing them by 8 gives us w minus 3. Notice we got w minus 3 both times. That's our common binomial. That lets you know you're doing it correctly. So w minus 3 is our first factor. And then those GCFs, w squared plus 8, are our second factor. Looking at number 3, look at your first two terms. Group those together. Ask yourself, what's their GCF? So when we look at the coefficients, 2 and 8, they're both divisible by 2. First term has x cubed, second term has x squared, so our GCF would be 2x squared. And dividing both of those terms by 2x squared would give us x plus 4. Then looking at the last two terms, ask yourself, what's their greatest common factor? Please notice that if this is a minus sign right here, you have to factor out a negative. Okay, so this sign here, it doesn't matter what this one is. If your second grouping starts with a minus sign, you must factor out a negative. Now we got -9, -36. Those are both divisible by 9. Okay, so I'm going to factor out -9. Dividing both of those terms by -9 would give us plus x plus 4. So notice we got x plus 4 the first time and we got x plus 4 the second time. That's our common binomial. So factoring that out leaves us with 2x squared minus 9. So our two factors are x plus 4 times 2x squared minus 9. Group together your first two terms, 20 and 28 are both divisible by 4. Look at your variables. The least amount of times a occurs is twice, so 4a squared is our greatest common factor. Dividing both of those terms by 4a squared would give us 5a minus 7. Move on to your last two terms. Ask yourself what's their greatest common factor. 15 and 21 are both divisible by 3. 1 plus 5 is 6, so we know that's divisible by 3. 2 plus 1 is 3, so we know that's divisible by 3. So we're going to factor out positive 5. If this sign is plus, we factor out a positive 3. Dividing them both by 3 would give us 5a minus 7. So notice 5a minus 7 is our common binomial. That's our first factor. And then the 4a squared plus 3 is our second factor. Example 5, group together your first two terms and ask yourself what's their greatest common factor. So the coefficients are 1. Now move on to your variables. They both have an x. The least amount of times x occurs is twice, so x squared is our greatest common factor. Dividing both those terms by x squared would give us x minus y. Then look at your last two terms. This term has an x, but the second one doesn't. They do both have a y, so the least amount of times y occurs is once. So our greatest common factor there is y. Dividing those both by y would give us x minus y. So we see how we got x minus y both times. That's our common binomial. We factor that out, which makes our second factor x squared plus y. What is the greatest common factor between these first two terms? So look at your coefficients first. They're 4 and 30. Those are both divisible by 2. And then they both have an r. The least amount of times is twice. So 2r squared is our greatest common factor. Dividing both of those terms by 2r squared would give us 2r minus 15s. Look at your last two terms and ask yourself what is the greatest common factor. Start by looking at your coefficients, 10 and 75. They both end in a 0 or 5, so they're both divisible by 5. They don't both have an r, but they do both have an s. So 5s is our greatest common factor. When I divide both terms by 5s, I would get 2r minus 15s. And 2r minus 15s is our common binomial. That's our first factor. And then the GCFs make up our second factor, 2r squared plus 5s. Thank you for watching the video. Please let me know if you have questions.